种族纲目，恰起种族纲目，少三下来压的是，特人讲的民族，历当光的内容在一起。
Okay, thank you, and it's good to see everybody again. And I'm probably just going to jump right in. Hopefully, it goes without saying how grateful I am to be here and how much I've been enjoying all of your company so far. But I want to cover a lot, so I'm just not going to waste any time. Can we just go to the next slide? I can actually read that pretty well. So I'm going to start by just setting the scene. I want to read a passage. This is from Russell Sergi Nema, and the date is December 5th. So this is just several days before going into Lhasa for the enthronement. And the Desi is writing about Tsangyang Gyatso, whom he just met shortly before this. And he says, well, he could not study much while traveling through Nakartse and the rest, owing to the circumstances of a caravan, the plethora of new arrivals into his presence. But upon reaching Nyetang, I myself being regularly present to meet with him privately, by and by he brought up all sorts of general and specific questions about challenging points of sutra, tantra, and the arts and sciences, such that his true wisdom was piously enriched and he gained confidence. Now, at the time, I answered these inquiries with what immediately came to mind, and if I was certain of the source, since I had brought many texts along with me, I would check the relevant citations in the evenings and give as much of an answer as I could there while we were in Nyetang. But it happened that some questions I could not answer, and we'd have to wait until we went back to Lhasa to consult the sources. Next slide. Now, the passage, it's quite a long passage. I'm just going to paraphrase this because I want to get to what comes after this. But the Desi brings up some minor grievances about the quality of the text that he was working with for his education in astronomy, uses the Swarode or Yangchar to instruct him on some points about, for instance, the process of death and rebirth. And as he says, as for the other arts and sciences, in the course of things, Tsangyang Gyatso had also been studying these after the fashion of a layperson. Let's go to the next slide. This is the part I wanted to get to. But the most important thing, so the Tibetan here is the part highlighted in orange. The most important thing was his obligation to turn the wheel of Dharma for ordinary folk, just as the fifth Dalai Lama had done, to wit, emphasizing the tradition of Manjushri Dharma Lord Tsongkhapa the Great. So I informed him about this obligation and about how to do so. And he requested that I assemble a composition that would use few words to convey a meaning that could be expanded or contracted with pointers for how to proceed. In other words, references to other relevant texts. And accordingly, in Nyetang, he made a start of learning from me this text, the Ngunjo Lha'i Ngachen. And this is what I want to talk about in my remarks today, this text. This is just another passage relevant. This happens about a month later. This is actually still in the middle of the enthronement ceremonies, during which the education of the Dalai Lama is ongoing. And very similar point here. For his intellectual progress, I felt the only truly important thing was serving his disciples by turning the wheel of Dharma. So, like His Holiness before him, he has studied extensively from the profound Dharma of Sutra and Tantra. Plus, to be an all-knowing one, not just in name, but equally in the sense, he also had to master the greater and lesser arts and sciences after the fashion of a layperson. So, having internalized the Ngunjo Lha'i Ngachen as a source for memorizing texts in the proper sequence, he could be somebody who would effortlessly turn the wheel of Dharma as it was currently being taught to him, primarily by the Panchen Rinpoche. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So this is the text in question here. The full title of it, Jogun Depe Shingsai Dendun Chochar Bepe Ngunjo Lha'i Ngachen. So the Lha'i Ngachen, that's the kind of title of the text, the Divine Drum, and it is a Ngundro Tam, and I would actually translate this as something like a rhetorical source book. And then we have the poetic title here. It brings down the reign of the good Dharma onto the fields of the faithful people. Now, this was started, as we just saw, shortly after the meeting of Desi Sangye Gyatso and Tsangyang Gyatso in December 1697, and the work on it continued for the rest of the year. It was the colophon at the end of the text is dated to August 1698. It could probably be considered a minor work of Desi Sangye Gyatso, definitely a lesser known one, not much read or discussed in scholarship if it's discussed at all. And there aren't many copies of it available so far to my knowledge. The one I'm using that I'll show some images of is held by the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, and there are scans of it of pretty poor quality on TBRC or BDRC. The imprint itself, I've been able to look at the text briefly at the library. It's not a great print, and then when you photocopy it, it makes it worse. So there's some challenges in reading it. I've also seen a attestation that there's a copy in the collection of the Potala as listed in this Karchak that I mentioned here. Yeah, let's keep it on this slide for now. So what is it? Well, what is indicated, really the question is what is meant by this term wunjotam, and it's about public oratory. Now, what is meant are the rhetorical forms and formulas and citations and transitions, in short, the kind of background information that the Dalai Lama should use to flesh out and enhance his discussions of various topics that he would be speaking about in various settings, ceremonial, celebratory, instructional, or ritual. The point is that speaking well is about far more than just getting the point across, and doing your ceremonial and ritual duties is about more than just going through the motions. At least for the Desi, as he was training this boy, you also had to be eloquent and capacious in your learning, and more than this, you had to know how to put the pieces together in the right way. And you had to use the right pieces in the first place. So this text was supposed to furnish the Dalai Lama with the appropriate textual references and turns of phrase and so forth, so that he could perform this obligatory role correctly. Now, on the surface, this makes it seem like a rather drab and formulaic text, in my opinion. Basically 200 folios of Buddhist boilerplate. A thick stew of quotations peppered with the occasional comment or performance note. And I don't think there are any really stunning revelations to be found here, but I do want to suggest that this text points us in the direction of what are to me some complex and potentially rich questions about how we think about this Sixth Dalai Lama in history. And I'm putting quotes around this Sixth Dalai Lama intentionally here, because I'm referring less to the flesh and blood teenage boy, the elusive human who seems to fascinate all of us, whose motivations we are trying so hard to grasp, largely through the medium of text, which, in my opinion at least, he's often scarcely visible at all. And I mean more something like the history of the image or the portrait of this figure, the process and the importance of how the Dalai Lama was constructed as a role, as a form of performance according to certain scripts, we might say. And of course, you could say that he's notorious precisely to the extent that he went, so to speak, off script. Now, as we've already seen from the passages I just quoted, what was at stake here is this notion of this duty incumbent on the role of the Dalai Lama to turn the wheel of the Dharma. Familiar enough phrase, but one with special significance in this context of the early Ganden Pochang. Insofar it was a constitutive part of the identity of the ruler and by extension the state itself. It was a major piece and perhaps arguably the central piece of the rubric of what proper political rule looked like. Now I have to stress here that when I speak of Buddhism in the context of the early Ganden Pochang, I mean it was more than just a tool or a useful resource for the government. It already shaped the world in which power was being exercised. It provided the vocabulary for naming its values and its aims, and in turn it formed the direct object of political action. It was the first basic lever for how to use power to achieve broader social or even cosmic transformation. In other words, it was essential to the very idea of politics for the rulers to assert this prerogative to be the foremost agent of Buddhism in the world. And again, when I say this, I don't mean merely being its patron or its protector. I mean something more fundamental. Not merely garnering its sanction, but staking a claim for the rulers of being the primary producers of Buddhism, the arbiters of how it was to be produced, and claiming intellectual and technical mastery over it. A claim which, in turn, I would argue, aligns very closely with the cosmopolitanism and humanism of this general era. So this is just to say that it's hardly incidental that this familiar obligation to turn the wheel would be appropriated to that project, or to put it another way, let's go to the next slide, what we might call specialist reading, to adopt a term from the scholar Paul Griffiths, would be essential to the moral and intellectual education, the creation of the persona that was being crafted for the political ruler. And this is just a kind of a signpost I thought that was helpful. As Griffiths says, specialists are likely to be needed when a community of religious leaders has political power. Knowing how to read in such a way as to be able to rule on political matters is not likely to be a skill available to non-specialist readers. And he even brings up the example, as you see, of Tibet. Now, I would actually take this a little differently than Griffiths, even though I think in general he's right here. Knowing how to read correctly is essential to political rule in this context, and not simply because of knowing how to rule on political matters. I think it gets at something far more fundamental than that. Indeed, I would suggest that we think of this obligation to be the foremost producer and purveyor of Dharma, to be its master, as a technique of proper rule. And this text is then, in that sense, a kind of a political document or official discourse, or in another way, a script for the role of the Dalai Lama. And so I don't mean something like cynical here. I'm not talking about this text as a kind of a document of propaganda. And I don't mean it's only about something like rhetorical persuasion or conversion. I mean something much more abstract and fundamental, that it is through these kinds of public demonstrations, in how they're structured, in the impressions they give, and in the actual messages delivered, how those messages are styled and organized in their form and content. Through these practices, something about the very nature of what political rule is and who the ruler is being expressed or possibly even created. So that's kind of the arc of how I'm approaching this text. Let's go to the next slide. So, time permitting, this is all I want to go over here. We'll see how far we can get. Say a couple more things about the education at Tsangyang Gyatso, just because I think it's a very interesting topic. Then the bulk of the talk, I want to actually walk you through this text. It's like I said, about 200 folios. There's a lot of really neat stuff in here. And then, if we have any time left over, I have some more theoretical kind of signposts that I want to bring into your attention that have shaped how I talk about this text. I'm looking at it in three ways: as a kind of official discourse, something that conveys and constitutes and represents the nature of what political rule means in this context. As I've just mentioned, I think of it as a script, as something that is part of the outer representation of the character of the Dalai Lama. And then that leads into some very interesting comparative reflections, especially here I'm looking at the work of the French scholar Louis Marin, who has worked on the Louis XIV, the almost contemporaneous emperor of France, who I think makes a very fitting comparison for the Dalai Lamas in the early Gendan Pochang. But we're probably not going to get to that, so you can ask me about it later. Let's go to the next slide. Just one more passage from the Segin. This is another one that gives some hints about his how he was doing with his education when the Desi first met him. And I suspect to a certain extent this text was prompted by the interviews that were being conducted after their first meeting at Nyetang, and we can only speculate about whether the Dalai Lama was living up to the very high standards set for his education by the Desi. So he says, back when he was at Sona, per my request and as beseeched by the Chuje, that's one of his two interlocutors, this is Silnan Dorje, he learned to recite from memory the entire Dratsang Duncha, the liturgy of the Namgyal College, as well as, among other things, the root text of the Nyangak Melong Kavya Darsha, the root grammar, both the root tantra and the explanatory tantra of the medical tantras, the latter one at least up to the part on urinalysis. He also got instruction on texts like my tarnish remover, that's the Vaidurya Karpa Yasel, and the root kosha text. Since the start of the Ox year, he had scant opportunity for study because of all the distractions, the many new arrivals, and so on. Most important thing, so same theme again, was to prioritize turning the wheel of Dharma, to which end, taking as a source the fifth Dalai Lama's text, which has this title, Jenang Rite Jinlap Ki Tsamjor Tinle Chugyun. I'll talk about that in a second. That was basically one of the inspirations for the Desis, the current text that we're reading. As mentioned above, starting from Nyetang in the mornings, he was studying my new composition, the Lha'i chen, the memorization of whose edits, without being requested, he was already beginning from the 15th. So pretty much right on the spot, after being put on his throne, he's getting put to work memorizing this text. Now you see here, let's go to the next slide, some clues to the education of the Dalai Lama. I've culled out most of the major passages in the Sergei Nyema on the annual or sometimes twice yearly reports that were being delivered to Lhasa of how his education was going. You get a lot of information here about the kinds of texts he's reading. We're not going to have time to go over all this, so I'll just highlight a couple neat things on here. But you see, he gets going with the alphabet and knowing how to read aloud in 1687, and his real education begins when his tutor arrives in 1690. And already by 1691, look at what he's reading, Vaidurya Karpo. He's memorizing the Vaidurya Karpo. He's learning the Namgyal College liturgy, and a number of works are mentioned there. And then later the same year, the Yasel, which is the companion text to the Vaidurya Karpo, clarifying many of the points that are expressed there. Let's go to the next slide. This one I'll focus on. This is one of the more meaty reports. So he's eight and a half years old at this point by Western reckoning. This is his reading list that he has here. That's his Gyatso and the Nyenjun, another text that prompted the responses of the Gyatso. So this is a kind of a critical interrogation of the Vajrakarpo. Sangwa Gechema of the Fifth Dalai Lama, Vajrakalpika Sutra. Vajrakarpo, again, the Namgyal College text, Kadam teachings, the Lamyum Chi Jampal Shelung, this text, Tsenjugi Jopa, that I believe this is actually the Trimeyud, the commentary on the Kala Chakra Tantra. He's learning grammar, he's learning mantras, and then his memorization is continuing, primarily, in this case, it looks like to me, Jangter texts that he's learning to memorize. Leu Dunma has special significance for the Dalai Lama and the Desi. Among other things, Sangpo Drakpa, the Tertun, was a past life of the Desi, or was claimed as a past life of the Desi. Actually, so this, to me, speaks to a point that Imaeda-san raised yesterday about the question of who did Tsangyang Gyatso think he was at this time, having been told that he was the Shalu Kenshin Toku. But to me, I look at this list and I think, if you're told that you're a Toku of someone and this is the homework you're being assigned, I think I could guess who you were in one or two guesses. It wouldn't be too hard. The theme that unites all these readings is the Fifth Dalai Lama. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is just more of the same. He's reading Kavya. He's reading the Rinpoche commentary on the Kavya Darsha. He's reading Kshemendra, so he's getting a lot of education in Kavya here. This is when he writes his two sadhana texts that get sent to Lhasa in manuscript form, his two earliest compositions. Let's go to the next slide. And so on and so forth. I'm afraid I can't spend too much time going over this, but this is a daunting reading list. So it also maybe speaks to questions we have about the factors that went into the, let's say, the way the Dalai Lama felt about himself at this time and the responsibilities that were being foisted upon him. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, I want to walk you through this text as much as I can, and I'm going to try to point out a couple neat things that I find in it. But let's start. Let me just give you, this is an overview of the gist of what we find in this text. Now, there's no kind of formal outline here. This is basically my way of breaking it down, but I also followed more or less in the colophon. We find he gives a decent synopsis of what he plans to talk about, and the text basically follows that pretty closely. The transitions between sections are sometimes quite fluid, and in other places, different topics are actually nested inside of each other. I'll show you some examples of that. So it was a tricky text to pull apart and figure out what was happening here. It begins with some prefatory material, some opening verses, and talking a little bit about why the text was written, or maybe more accurately, why it wasn't necessary to write it in certain senses. Then we get some really introductory Buddhist topics for about 40 folios. This is quite familiar stuff. And there's a very interesting section on relevant topics. We're talking at the Munlam Chenmo and also the Tsokcha Chenmo, the holiday that happened in the second month to commemorate the fifth Dalai Lama's death. Then there's a very long section on Tantra. That's the part that is basically taken verbatim from a text written by the fifth Dalai Lama. And then the parts that are, to me, the most interesting, sections 5 and 6 have much more to do with oratory, with how to be a proper public speaker, and how to tailor remarks to different audiences, different occasions, how to give basically informed, intelligent background information on all kinds of things, but to do so also in a very eloquent way. And in section 6, how to address your audience appropriately, how to name different people in the seated assembly, how to express your gratitude. There's a lot of very, very interesting material here for thinking about the art of how to be a good public speaker. So now let's dive into the text a little more, if you could go to the next slide. Now I pulled out two passages in the prefatory material that I found quite interesting. It's a common theme here. There's no need to give this kind of education to a being who's already omniscient. As you can see in this first line, Chir Chokorgi Unjola Sopa Kanya Yedomane Rangshingi Jupe Kempa Shentang Majawe Chotongi Ngango Tong Tumpe Sensi La Sopa Galaang Madopar Bemedu Jungon Mase. So he can learn this effortlessly without having to rely on any kind of work in any way, because it's something he knows primordially. It's naturally established as a kind of an innate, inherited wisdom. And so that's one reason why this is kind of an anti-purpose, why the text was not necessary. Another, and this is a more disparaging remark here, you see in this second part, I'll just paraphrase this second part. Apart from some nice language of a chen, a high lama, or some other important learned person, saying, I'm going to do this sort of person is teaching this sort of text. Apart from this kind of nice language, these days, mostly what I find is they do nothing more. Their tongues grow short, and all they do is give the words of the empowerment, and they don't provide any kind of longer lecture explanation that would be pertinent to the sources, the purposes, and so on and so forth. So this is the Desi's critical justification. He's quite critical of the shortcomings of other religious public speakers who lack the kind of vast, broad, cosmopolitan education that he's trying to impose on the Sixth Dalai Lama, in which I would surmise he considers himself the paragon of, like the Fifth Dalai Lama before him. So it's kind of a very crass remark of saying, like, what's even the point? Nobody even knows how to give a proper speech these days. Then he very neatly also quotes Sakya Pandita here on the bottom. It's not just that the Dalai Lama is sort of supernaturally brilliant. The passage reads roughly something like, you have to keep learning even though you might die, because even if you don't reach a high level of scholarship in this lifetime, it transfers over to your next life like inheriting your own money out of the bank. You withdraw your knowledge from the bank between one lifetime and the next. And I think that's a very fascinating idea that I like very much. And so this is how he walks into beginning to talk about the material of this text, as you see at the end here. And then he basically gets going with the rest of the text. Let's go on to the next slide. I'm actually going to skip this part. I just want you to see what's in here. This is what I call basic Buddhism. This is all very, very familiar material. So I just want you to look at that for a couple seconds, and then I'll move on to the next part. Mulan Chemo, and et cetera. Really, he means also the Tsokchu Chemo, as I mentioned. That's a holiday that started on the 25th of the second month, and at that time it was about a week long, and revolved around the Potala Palace and the Zamling Genchiki Choten, the stupa of the Fifth Dalai Lama. Most of this has to do with how do you talk about the Buddha, but talking about the Buddha becomes, in a way, kind of a prefatory way of really talking about especially the Fifth Dalai Lama and to a lesser extent the Desi himself. I'll show you an example of this in just a second. And then, like in many other parts of this text, after making his general comments about how to talk about these topics, the Desi will give a very specific example at length. In this case, Tsongkhapa. So you get about 12 folios of how to talk about Tsongkhapa, mostly drawn out of the Vaidurya Serpo. Let's go to the next slide. I put some passages up for you to look at here. So you can see that this is kind of I would rate this in the middle of the quality of the reproductions of these. This is not the easiest but not the hardest folios to read. Now where I typed this up, where it says Perjit Tsamdu Khladim Munlamdu, that is on the fifth line of the top folio there, if you want to actually venture to try to read that block print yourself. And again, I'll just kind of paraphrase it. He's giving some history of the history of giving teachings at the Munlam, starting with in the time of Tsongkhapa, when Tsongkhapa instituted this holiday, he developed also a tradition of giving kachu, giving public lectures. And then in later years, not only would they, where'd that go? They would basically use primarily the 34 chapter Jataka of Arya Shura, but then I'm just going to have to wing it, I guess, until that comes back. In the time of, I believe it was Gendin Drup, the second Dalai Lama, they began alternating with Kshemendra's Avadana Kalpalata. And that's really a shame because this is one of the saltier passages, but he basically says something along the lines of the fact that he's quite disappointed with the paucity of the lectures that were being provided by the main public speakers at the Munlam. He thought they had gone back to relying exclusively on the 34 chapter Jataka, and typically they didn't continue from year to year. They would only really do the beginning of, they'd get through a few chapters, and then the next year they wouldn't pick up where they left off, and he's quite disappointed in this fact, and is critical of them. He even surmises that they could not, as he puts it roughly, untie the knots of Dundan. They didn't have the skill to unpack the difficult language of Kavya through which one should properly talk about the life of the Buddha. And so then that is followed by roughly 2 or 3 folios of fleshing out many, many other texts that you can use to talk about the life of the Buddha. And what the Desi is especially interested in are episodes in sutras and tantras of the Buddha generating bodhicitta before other Buddhas in his past lives. And he gives probably a dozen sources for this. The most important for his purposes are the Karna Pundarika Sutra, that's Nyingje Pema Karpo-do, and Mayopama Samadhi Sutra, Gyuma Dabu Tingi Zingi-do. And this is a moment of intertextuality because you find very matching conversations in many of the Desi's other texts, especially Dukula, Volume Nga, and Vaidya Serpo, and really bringing up all these instances of the generating bodhicitta of a Shakyamuni Buddha is prefatory to talking about the same thing for the fifth Dalai Lama as a way of introducing the discourse of the connection between the Dalai Lama and Avalokiteshvara. So one of the reasons for fleshing out how one talks at Munlam about Shakyamuni is really that it becomes a way to talk about the fifth Dalai Lama. And I was going to have another passage on there that I was planning to read for you, where then he basically says, oh, well, I'm just the only one who can't see it then. Where are we now? Yeah, let's do this one. I'm sorry I didn't put that in Tibetan. I only have it in Wylie. There's quite a few parts that the reading is unclear. Now it's gone. Yeah, okay. It's kind of hard for me to see at this angle. Kapgar, on some occasions. You should also talk about how Tsongkhapa generated bodhicitta. And your source for that, Sara Dzipe Gandin Chuchung. Sara is Desi Sangye Gyatso. That's his pen name. This is the Vaidya Serpo. Use that as your source. You can also Tsokchu Chemor Tanda Dukle Ngape Goju Chirimpuche. So these days we also use the volume Nga, the Dukla, sometimes to talk about these things. If you want Sapshe Dabuam, Nirdu Seldu Tangna, if you want something more in-depth, use Mejung Kalpama Gyalwa, the commentary to the Mejung Kalpama. This is a text called the Mutik Chumpo. Mejung Kalpama is the Chungrap of the fifth Dalai Lama, written by that's a shame. Anyways, then I'll skip the rest. These are all basically texts by the Desi. He's going through his whole corpus and teaching you how to use his corpus to talk about things at Munlam. Let's go to the next slide. Here's the Tantra section. This, like I said, is taken mostly verbatim from a text by the fifth Dalai Lama, but interspersed with very long excurses on how to give lineages and histories for especially Kala Chakra, Gulya Samaja, Chakra Samvara, and Vajrabhairava. He also adds a very long section on Nyingma with specific discussions of the rebirths of Tri Songdetsen, that is to say, past lives of the fifth Dalai Lama, according to the Jangter tradition, very important material. And then Rigzen Gudem, Nyangrel, and other figures. Let's go to the next slide. This is the stuff that I like best. How to discuss the history and sacred objects at various sites. If you're giving a speech at Lhasa or at the Potala, you have 10 folios on how to talk about the statues inside the Potala Palace. Also, you get remarks for how to talk about sacred objects at the major seats of the Gelugpa school. Let's go to the next slide. And this is my favorite part. Rhetorical addresses for different members of the seated assembly. There's a whole poetic discourse of how to describe how they sit in the drell, the seated rows, with different, as Dan Martin mentioned yesterday, the surgyen, those who ornament the edges of the assembly, the principal chief elite figures, unyen, they hold down the head of the assembly, and so on and so forth. And here sometimes we have interspersed what seem like tremendous digressions. So when he talks about how to name the Sangha in general and how they sit, actually what you talk about when you talk about the Sangha is the Sanghigi Dempa and the Dempe Netse, the measure of the existence of the Buddhist teachings in the world, chronologies of how long Buddhism will last. Especially he uses the 5,000-year chronology from the Bhumtika on the 100,000 Prajnaparamita and the four ages of a Kala Chakra. And this is all very political discourse because it was imperative to the Desi to say how Ganden Potrang existed in history, in what kind of age was it existing in, because the project of the Ganden Potrang was to create the Dzogten, the Krita Yuga, the perfected age. So you get a lot of chronological discourse here. Let's move on. I just want to show you as much as I can before I run out of time. Site-specific rhetorical remarks. Another long section on how to talk about cosmology and how to tailor specific ways of speaking to places like Potala and the Densasum, the three seats. Let's go to the next slide again. 2 minutes left. Can I pause my time while the slides come back? I don't even know what to say now. I'll just kind of paraphrase. The last portion of the text, then, he gives many formulas for how to express gratitude for different groups of people, starting from the Buddha, of course, but moving up all the way, especially gratitude for Tsongkhapa, how to talk about gratitude for the Dalai Lamas, for the Ganden Pochang, for the Desi himself, and those are also supposed to be used at certain times and places. Then also we have a very long section of prayers and blessings, and these are quite familiar, of course, but I was, oh, thanks. It's okay, I can just wing it, it's fine. I had highlighted to show you a very nice way of how to pray for the longevity and stability of the Ganden Podrangi Chusi Sungden, and a very nice prayer for the Desi himself, appropriate for teachings at the Tsokje Chemo. So let me just try to jump to my conclusion now, and we'll see if, let's start jumping ahead now. Let's go way ahead. Keep going. This is all this stuff I would have, we're going to skip these. These are some very nice passages. Okay, I want to leave it here. This is good. This is from Irving Goffman, a very famous book, The Presentation of Self. It talks about the scriptedness of elite roles. Basically, his point is the more prestigious and more authoritative you are, the more bound to the role you are. The more that you have to inhabit the character of what you're supposed to be like, and the less you can break character. And as he puts it, the limiting case is heads of state who have no teammates. They are all script. A king is a role before it is a person. And I think this is a helpful way of thinking about how the Desi was creating Tsangyang Gyatso in the image of the Dalai Lama as the ruler of Tibet. And then one more slide here. This is too complex. I don't think I can get into this. This is the semiotic stuff about representation and power. The power of representation and the representation of power. And I just think that's actually a very useful lens for thinking about the role of Buddhism, of teaching Buddhism, of eloquence and mastery and intelligence as shaping the character of the Dalai Lama, and by extension the state of which he was the head. That through this text it is not just a way of representing his power, but it is also itself a kind of way of creating power through representation. So I guess I'll have to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for two great talks. I have a very short question to Ian. So one of the slides mentions that Tsangyang Gyatso practiced calligraphy first, and then it is specifically mentioned that he practiced calligraphy on paper. Does it mean that he started trying to write on wooden books, on a wooden book, not on a paper?
I don't know. I think they specifically mentioned paper in that one, and indeed, even in some of the early reports, even before he was able to write texts, he was writing little snippets of, first they were bringing samples of his handwriting to show to the Desi, who liked it very much, and then he wrote something like Sangye Gyatso Tupa, or something like, some document was, this is for Sangye Gyatso, and then eventually he wrote these two sadhana texts. But I don't know whether he was working on some kind of samta or something like that. I don't know. Yeah.
It's just common practice, right, to start writing on this wooden kind of book, covered with soot or something like that, and only after that a person can continue practicing on paper. So maybe this is what is implied here.
Yeah, I'm probably the last person who would know about customary practices like that, but that's very helpful to me to know that. There is an anecdote of when the Desi was an 8-year-old boy and he was first meeting his tutor, they were tracing, if I remember correctly, they were tracing characters out in the dust on the floor of the room in the potala, and then there were some auspicious signs that took place. Yeah, but thank you. Yeah. Could I get a translation microphone, please?
Brief translation. First point, he mentioned that your Shoku's presentation was wonderful, amazing. It's almost 99% complete. But he wanted to feel that 1% as a comment, not expecting any answer. Where he was saying that there was a time when a long life offering was offered to the Sixth Dalai Lama. just before the offering of the Mendel Tensum, he suddenly got up and left the place. And Desi was surprised, wanted to get up, but he was already an old man who couldn't do that. So all this clearly shows that the Sixth Dalai Lama is a very stubborn person. When he feels something, he decides it. Doesn't care what others are thinking. So he wanted to compliment that with your talk, not expecting an answer. Then to your presentation, he said that your presentation was so good in the sense that not many of the presenters before made such a complete presentation on the process of study of the Sixth Dalai Lama, including all the sutric, tantric texts that he studied. So thank you so much. That's what he was saying.
Well, I'd be interested to look at the copy in Gangtok to see if the print is clearer, because there are some passages in this one that are quite difficult to read, and I've been able to see photographs of the LTWA one, and it's a little easier, but there are some tricky passages. As far as you said, modern classical education, I think that's a really excellent way of putting it. The theme I've seen elsewhere in a lot of Desi's writings is a kind of almost paradoxical idea that when he always is justifying how superlative and excellent his works are, and often he does so by, in a sense, claiming to be, whether this is true, or whether he's correct or not is a different matter, but what he claims is to be, as I would put it, getting the tradition right completely and for the first time. And so he often talks of his works as unprecedented, not because they're new, but because in a sense they have the most fidelity to tradition as possible, whether it's getting the iconometric proportions of statues perfectly correct, or in this case, mastering the wealth of scripture available to talk about one or another subject. There is something very modern about this kind of breadth of mastery, but its modernity it's classicism in a sense. So I think actually I'm going to borrow that phrase because it's very nice. I like it. Thank you. Many experts of Munyo in the room who can probably find you and discuss more about, for example, the Gushangnang, and there were many speakers who spoke about this earlier. I believe your second question, you were asking whether the fact of the birth of the Sixth Dalai Lama in this region was a factor in the delay before announcing the death of the Fifth Dalai Lama. Did I hear you correctly? Yeah. Okay. No, I don't think so. The main source we have for understanding the decisions is the Desi's Nawe Junlen, and we have to read that somewhat critically because, of course, he's an interested party in this process, and this text is partly written, I think, as a way of explaining and justifying his actions to people who were critical of him. It was written at a very fraught moment in 1696. But in that text, he does describe the process of doing divinations and consulting the oracles to decide how to respond to the death on the basis of instructions that were given to him to conceal that death by the great Fifth Dalai Lama. And I can add as a parenthetical that there were many other precedent examples of keeping a death a secret for a period of a year or more, both in kind of the lore that they hearkened back to. For instance, some of the lore around Trisongdetsen and Mune Tsempo was relevant in this context. I believe from the Bashe Shaptakma is the source for that. And more relevantly, Depa Sonam Rapten, for example's death was kept a secret. But the question was put to the divination of whether they, I forget the options, but it was like right away, or when they find the rebirth, or when he comes of age. There were several options, and the answer that fell in the divination was to wait until he comes of age to be seated on his throne. So that's the official justification for the process. So in a sense, it was decided years before even locating the boy. If we are inclined to believe him that this is precisely what happened. There are several indications in the Desi's writings that he was originally inclined to release the secret after 12 years. That would have been a full cycle of the zodiac, and it also would have been timed with the inauguration of the Tsokchu Chemo holiday, which was tied to the construction of the tomb for the Fifth Dalai Lama. And I believe there are several places where he mentions the word of the secret leaking out. It's a question for future research, and maybe people here would be well equipped to conduct that research. Following the evidence for who knew what and when. Certain people were led into the secret at certain times along the way. For example, the Terdak Lingpo was told very quickly. But I think it's still a question to be determined precisely who knew what and when, and how the news of this trickled out and in what fashion. But I can't give an answer more than that. But I don't think it was in any way determined by the geographical location of the boy.
I know this is a little bit cheeky, or is this working? So I know I sent you a document like 2 days ago, and Professor Van der Kuyp was also supposed to talk about this text, and he's not here. It's a Namtar of Tsangyang Gyatso written in 1698 by Khalkhazai Bandita Losang Jinle, one of the earliest Namtars we have of Tsangyang Gyatso written in Tibetan while he was alive. It's not very long, it's about 8 folios, so 16 pecha pages, front and back. And I've always wondered which writings of the Desi was inspired by, because Khalkhazai Bandita, he lived from 1642 to 1715. Much of his writings were based on the writings of the Desi, the Vaidura Serpo, the Namtar of Fifth Dalai Lama, but with the many versions that, Ian, you're so familiar with, I was wondering which might have influenced this the most. You don't have to answer this right now, but it's something that's intrigued me for years.
Yeah, I saw your email and I didn't read it yet. But we've talked about this before. At least the short biography of Desi Sangye Gyatso that we find in the Topyik of Jaya Pandita follows very closely what we see in the Vaidura Serpo. And he mentions receiving that text at a certain point, and then the other work of the Desis that he mentions receiving is a Tokme Kalpama. That was on one of my slides, but I went very quickly past it. Tokme Kalpama is a companion to the Mejung Kalpama. It's a trunga for the Desi. I wrote an article about it about 5 years ago. It's short. It lists, I believe, 20 past lives of Desi Sangye Gyatso that are connected to those of, and the sources are basically Kadam Lake Bampucha and the let's call it the network of Jangter prophetic literature around, especially Jangdak Tashi Topgyal, Ngari Pancham Hemawangel, and Nyangarel and Guru Churwang, who are cast as past lives of the 5th Dalai Lama in a line going to Trisong Detsen. So basically, other characters are stitched into that for the Desi using the same source base. And I would venture that, I'll look at it, I'd venture the biography of Tsangyang Gyatso probably draws on what we see in Vaidura Serpo. That would be my first guess, yeah. But conversely, I would be quite interested to see if how it deviates from what the Desi wrote. That would be very interesting and useful to me to see that, yeah.
I think we talked about this briefly yesterday, but I think it might be interesting for everyone too. One of the narratives that doesn't seem to be in the Desis is when, in Jayabandita's version, when the search party arrives in Manul, and they start presenting different statues of different lamas to the young Tsangyang Gyatso. And when the statue of Tsongkhapa was presented, then he puts it on his head, puts it down. And then he was presented with a statue of the Karmapa, and he takes it, puts it upside down, and starts hitting it on the table. And then takes it to his breast and starts to pretend to breastfeed it. So I think that was one that wasn't there. I briefly remember it from reading it now more than 7 years ago. But.
No comment.
That's wise.
Professor MacCormack, I have a quick question about the genre of Nindra Tam. So Desi Sangye Gyatso's text, did you get the impression it was really specifically intended for someone Gyatso to be reading and using? Or did it have the feel of being a broader text aimed not just at Tsangyang Gyatso, but in general, anyone hoping to embody this role of political/spiritual leader? And then along with that, within the genre of Nindra Tam, have you been able to compare it to any other authors' Nindra Tam text and see if there's similarities or differences?
Thanks, those are good questions. The first one, in both cases, my answer is basically I don't know, but I'll venture a guess. In the first case, I would guess it was primarily for Tsangyang Gyatso. I think my sense is that the Desi was very concerned with the training of this boy at that time, and had a very clear vision of the role he expected him to fulfill. So that would be my guess. As far as generic comparisons, I have in the past, it's been a long time, but I looked a lot at some of this Tam literature, because the Desi has another text that's called the Losar Beldam, and it basically recreates a sample speech that would have been delivered in the Potala on the New Year. And indeed, we find many, many short attestations to these kinds of speeches being delivered by members of his circle. There were several people that are named frequently as very good public speakers, and often they were famed for their skill at memorization. I believe that speaks to this idea of a kind of a modern classical education. A good speaker had on the tip of their tongue a lot of things that they could draw on, and a dynamism where they could find the right passage for any moment or occasion. The section in there that had to do with addressing the seated rows, the drell, and that is a very common practice, and that you find in many older texts that are labeled either Beltam or Yetam or Moltam. There's many different labels. I've looked at ones by Taranatha and Shakya Chokden, for example. I remember Lochen Dharma Shri wrote one contemporaneous with this. And all those texts use some variant on that formula. It was written about already long ago by David Jackson in his book on the Moas of Mustang, which is a really excellent book. But that is a very common practice. But as far as the content of the scriptural material you see here, I don't know. It's quite different from those other Tam texts, which generally are split into Micha and Flacha, basically genealogies of whatever noble family is sponsoring the event at which you're speaking, and then histories of Dharma that are tailored to that location. Here, as you saw, it's more like this structure of Buddhism, from the basics to the Buddha biographies to the tantric material to this more, let's call it, cosmopolitan discussion of like the palace and the statues and kavya and cosmology and so on and so forth. I don't know if, apart from the Desi's corpus, where you find all the same themes reiterated again and again and again, I don't know of other texts that resemble this. Yeah, I think, it's a really valid question and a difficult one to answer. And I should just clarify that the material that I provided on the slides only really covers the reports that were being brought by Dopa and the Chuje, Silnden Dorje, in this period from, I think, 1687 until 1690, 1696 or 7. I forget when the last educational update was provided. There's a wealth of other material on his education just in the Rapsal Sergi Nima alone. And I was also focusing on his textual studies, but we could mention, so when he was in Nakatse, he met Dorje Drak Tolku Pematinle and Terdak Lingpa, and they began to provide maybe not, education is not precisely the right word, but tutelage in their tantric practice. And then later on, during his enthronement, he began his studies with the Panchen Lama, which were, that was his sort of education in the, for example, he was given transmissions of the teachings of the previous Dalai Lamas, and I haven't looked systematically at the rest of the text yet, because frankly I ran out of time, and not to mention I didn't have any time to spare in my discussion to get into it anyways. But as far as the tone of the reports that were being sent to the Desi during the years at Tsona, in the beginning they're quite effusive. They're not everything he does is perfect. He has an almost otherworldly. He learns incredibly quickly, like no other. And that that language is not atypical of hagiographical literature in general, where you have to kind of read between the lines if you wish to speculate about whether the truth of his education was maybe not as flowery as the reports would make it seem. It's pure speculation, of course. Eris was basically, I think he looked at the list of texts and said, no way a boy would have any interest in studying this stuff. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. That would be my first impression too. But then again, mainly because I find the Vairagya Karpa almost impossible. It's an incredibly challenging text for me. But I come from a completely different world, so I don't want to superimpose my judgments of what would be hard or easy to teach upon this context. But those reports speak only of memorization and reading. Those are the two verbs that we see being used. I would give the benefit of the doubt to the fact that he was doing what they said he was doing, that at the very least he was memorizing a lot of this material. And as how his level of how adept he was at it, who can say? I don't really think we have evidence. We can only speculate one way or the other using something like common sense. Certainly it's a daunting education because as I tried to suggest in my talk, the role created for him was by definition a very daunting role. Much was expected of him. And he had big shoes to fill, I think. So I think it's very reasonable to raise those critiques. I just don't know if we have the resources to answer them or not.
First he said that he had taken 2 occasions to ask question. Excuse me for that. Because by learning that we have some time, I dare to ask these questions. But again, this is really comment and observation to Shogu's thing. He was saying that because these questions have been raised about the reliability of many of the things mentioned there. So Geshe-la was saying that for him, the works by Lelung is really reliable. And he makes a comparison between Lelung Shepe Dorje and the Sixth Dalai Lama. Both are really, really outspoken, straightforward. And there are more than 40 volumes at his credit, Lelung Shepe Dorje. And some of the texts that he composed are so straightforward that they are not published for fear of criticism and things like that. For example, there's one volume where he mentions about he's having hundreds of consorts, right? And then he wanted to publish it, and then his attendant rather suggested that please don't do. It will bring a lot of criticism. Then he said, no problem. If they want to criticize, let them criticize, but I am doing this for the benefit of somebody achieving enlightenment. So anyway, Geshe-la is saying with the confidence, because they are over 40 volumes at his credit, or actually he's not just talking about it, without any understanding. He has in fact audited the 40 volumes when it was once all published. So therefore we can safely take it as a reliable text. Then my old man's brain is failing. So regarding the Sixth Dalai Lama's being banished, Geshe-la was saying it was purely political purposes. From a religious point of view, he is still having some kind of acceptance that this must be the Sixth Dalai Lama. But so the banishment was purely out of political concerns. And there also, Lelung mentioned that these people, unless they see the hell or experience the hell by themselves, they will not believe in anything. This is mentioned. This is mentioned by Lha'i Khan.
Now, Geshe-la made one important remark relating to the life of Sixth Dalai Lama. This remark was made by Lha'i Khan himself after he was banished. So Lha'i Khan had told somebody, maybe to the Lelung Shepe Dorje, that this Gyatso is a very exceptional person. He's a very different and exceptional person. But he is such a person, he will not believe unless he will see the hell. So this statement, Geshe-la says, this is the indication that he was simply banished for political reason, not being him as a fake Dalai Lama. So he was Lha'i Khan himself inside, except that he is really a special man, Dalai Lama. But for a political reason, so he need to be vanished because something like that. So best English translation.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your excellent questions and comments. Let's give a round of applause to our two speakers again. You want this?